On the evening of June 8, 1969, in a small house in San Salvador, an 18-year-old girl named Amelia Bolaños sat in front of her family's television and watched Honduras score the winning goal against her country. She stood up. She walked to her father's desk. She opened the drawer. She took out his pistol, and she shot herself. Her funeral was broadcast on national television. The president of El Salvador attended. A military honor guard carried her coffin through the streets. Newspapers called her a martyr. The national football team walked behind the casket in their uniforms, heads bowed, an entire country watching. She was 18 years old, and she died because of a football match. This is not a metaphor. This is not an exaggeration. This is not one of those stories where someone says football's life and death and everyone nods and nobody means it literally. In the summer of 1969, a World Cup qualifier between two Central American countries that most of the world couldn't point to on a map triggered a chain of events so savage, so irrational, and so catastrophically real that by the time it was over, 6,000 people were dead, 12,000 were wounded, 300,000 were homeless, and fighter jets were dogfighting over cornfields in the last piston-engine aerial combat in human history. They called it the football war, and it is the most terrifying thing the beautiful game has ever produced. To understand how a football match starts a war, you have to understand what El Salvador and Honduras were in 1969, because they weren't just countries. They were pressure cookers with the lids welded shut. El Salvador was the smallest country in Central America, about the size of New Jersey. Except New Jersey doesn't have 5 million people crammed onto volcanic hillsides, with almost no arable land, governed by a military dictatorship that stayed in power by making sure the population was always angry at someone other than the government. Honduras was bigger, emptier, more land, fewer people. And for decades, that imbalance had created an invisible migration. Hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans crossing the border into Honduras, settling on unused farmland, building lives in a country that technically didn't want them there. By 1969, roughly 300,000 Salvadorans were living in Honduras. That's the equivalent of 6% of El Salvador's entire population living inside a neighboring country that increasingly resented their presence. Honduras had an immigration problem it didn't know how to solve. El Salvador had a population problem it didn't know how to solve. Both countries were run by military strongmen who understood one thing with absolute clarity. If the people are angry, make sure they're angry at someone across the border, not at you. That was the gasoline. The football was the match. June 1969, World Cup qualifying. The 1970 tournament in Mexico was approaching, and in the CONCACAF region, one qualifying slot remained. Two countries wanted it, El Salvador and Honduras. Neither had ever been to a World Cup. For nations this small, this poor, this invisible on the world stage, a place at the World Cup wasn't just sporting achievement. It was proof of existence. Proof that the world knew you were alive. They would play 3 matches, home and away, and if needed, a third on neutral ground. Winner goes to Mexico, loser stays home. Nobody, not the players, not the coaches, not the fans, not the military generals watching from their offices, understood what they were about to set in motion. Match 1, Tegucigalpa, Honduras, June 8, 1969. The Salvadoran national team arrived in the Honduran capital the day before the match. They checked into their hotel. They tried to sleep. They couldn't. Outside the hotel, Honduran fans gathered in the hundreds. They threw rocks at the windows. They set off firecrackers all night. Not the small ones, the industrial kind, the ones that sound like gunshots and shake the walls. They leaned on car horns. They banged on metal drums. They chanted and screamed and made sure that not a single Salvadoran player slept more than 20 minutes that night. By kickoff the next day, the Salvadoran team was exhausted. Their eyes were hollow. Their legs were dead. Honduras won 1-0, and the stadium erupted. Not with joy, but with something uglier. Something that had been building for years and had finally found a release valve. That night, back in San Salvador, Amelia Bolaños watched the goal on television, and the next morning, her country buried her like a fallen soldier. She was 18. She had never met a single player on the team. She had never been to Honduras, and she was dead. The Salvadoran press turned her into a symbol, not of mental illness, not of a young woman in crisis, but of national honor, of what Honduras had done to El Salvador, of what the enemy had taken. The newspapers printed her photograph beside the Honduran flag. The message was clear without anyone needing to say it out loud. They did this to us. They will pay. Match 2, San Salvador. El Salvador, June 15, 1969. 1 week later, the return leg, and now it was Honduras's turn to visit enemy territory. The Honduran team arrived in San Salvador under armed military escort. They needed it. Salvadoran mobs surrounded their hotel. Windows were smashed. Fires were lit outside the entrance. 2 Honduran fans were killed in the streets. The team was smuggled out through back exits and taken to the stadium under guard. Inside the stadium, the atmosphere was beyond anything football was designed to contain. The crowd was not cheering. The crowd was screaming, burning Honduran flags, holding photographs of Emilio Bolaños. The referee later said he feared for his life. El Salvador won 3-0. The margin didn't matter. The football didn't matter. What mattered was what was happening outside the stadium, outside the city, across both countries, in the villages, in the farmlands where Salvadoran migrants lived among Honduran neighbors who were now suddenly violently their enemies. In Honduras, the backlash was immediate. Salvadoran immigrants, families who had lived in Honduras for years, for decades, were attacked. Their homes were burned. Their crops were destroyed. Mobs armed with machetes and farm tools roamed the countryside looking for Salvadorans to drive out. The Honduran government did nothing to stop it. Some reports suggested elements of the military actively participated. Thousands of Salvadorans fled across the border, entire families running with whatever they could carry, leaving behind farms, houses, lives, pouring into an El Salvador that was already too small, too crowded, too poor to absorb them. The Salvadoran government broke off diplomatic relations with Honduras, and both nations began moving troops toward the border. Over a football match, over a qualifier for a tournament in Mexico, over 90 minutes of sport that had somehow ripped open every wound these two countries had been pretending didn't exist. Match 3, Mexico City, Mexico, June 27, 1969. The third match was played on neutral ground, Mexico City, Azteca Stadium. Both teams arrived under armed security. The stadium was ringed with police. The match itself was extraordinary. The kind of game that, in any other context, would be remembered as a classic. Honduras took the lead. El Salvador equalized. Honduras scored again. El Salvador equalized again. Extra time. And then, in the 101st minute, a player named Mauricio Rodriguez, a man whose name should be far more famous than it is, scored the winning goal. El Salvador 3, Honduras 2. El Salvador were going to the World Cup. Outside the stadium, Salvadoran fans wept with joy. Honduran fans wept with rage. And somewhere between Mexico City and Central America, the last thread holding two nations together snapped. July 14, 1969. 17 days after the final match, less than 3 weeks. At 5:50 in the afternoon, the Salvadoran Air Force launched bombing raids against targets inside Honduras. Simultaneously, the Salvadoran army crossed the border in a full-scale ground invasion. Tanks, infantry, artillery, airstrikes. This was not a skirmish. This was not a border dispute resolved with angry letters. This was a military invasion of one sovereign nation by another, launched by a government that had watched its population reach boiling point over 3 football matches and decided that the only way to release the pressure was to open the valve with a war. The fighting lasted 100 hours, 4 days of combat across the Honduran countryside. Salvadoran troops advanced along the main highway connecting the two countries, pushing the Honduran army into retreat. Honduran fighter planes, ancient Corsairs and Mustangs from the Second World War, propeller-driven museum pieces that had no business being in the air, engaged Salvadoran jets in dogfights above the jungle. This was 1969, the same month that Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, and two countries in Central America were fighting aerial battles with aircraft designed in 1944. The Organization of American States intervened on July 18th and brokered a ceasefire. Salvadoran troops withdrew in early August, and the killing stopped. 6,000 dead, 12,000 wounded, 50,000 homeless, 300,000 Salvadorans displaced. The economies of both countries devastated. Border trade destroyed overnight. A region destabilized so profoundly that the aftershocks would be felt for a generation. 100 hours. That's all it took. Here is the ending that makes this story unbearable. El Salvador qualified for the 1970 World Cup. They went to Mexico. They played 3 matches in the group stage. They lost to Belgium. They lost to Mexico. They lost to the Soviet Union. They scored 0 goals. 0. In 3 games, they finished last in their group, won nothing, achieved nothing, contributed nothing to the tournament, and flew home to a country that had gone to war, that had killed thousands, displaced hundreds of thousands, burned homes and villages and farms for the right to go to Mexico and lose every game without scoring a single time. The prize they fought a war to win gave them nothing. And the war itself, the 100 hours that were supposed to release the pressure, solve the immigration crisis, settle the score, solved nothing. Honduras closed its border permanently. 300,000 Salvadoran migrants were pushed back into a country that couldn't hold them. The overcrowding worsened. The poverty deepened. The political instability intensified. 10 years later, El Salvador collapsed into a civil war that lasted 12 years and killed 75,000 people. Historians trace a direct line from the football war of 1969 to the Civil War of 1979. The displacement, the economic destruction, the militarization of a society that had tasted war and couldn't put the weapon down. 3 football matches in June 1969, 100 hours of fighting in July, 75,000 dead in the decade that followed, because of a qualifier for a World Cup where they didn't score a single goal. People say football is life and death. They say it at dinner tables and in pubs and on podcasts and in YouTube comments. They say it because it sounds dramatic and passionate and because we all love the idea that a sport can mean that much. But in Central America, in the summer of 1969, it was true. A teenager shot herself because her country lost the first leg of a qualifier. Mobs burned homes because of the second. A government invaded a neighboring nation because of the third. And 6,000 people died because 2 countries that couldn't solve their problems through politics decided to solve them through football. And when football couldn't hold the weight they placed on it, the whole thing collapsed into fire. The football war is the story nobody tells when they talk about the beautiful game. It's the chapter that gets left out of the highlight reels and the nostalgic documentaries and the soft-focus retrospectives about how football brings the world together. Because sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes a football match doesn't unite people. Sometimes it gives them permission to do the thing they've been wanting to do for years. Sometimes the referee's whistle isn't the start of a game. It's the start of something that can't be stopped. Tegucigalpa, San Salvador, Mexico City, 3 matches, 3 cities, 3 weeks.